All right. Do you got?
Yes, it says you're recording.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. So honored with the guests that we have on. We have Elizabeth Vos, who is a contributor to Consortium News. She is the co-host of Consortium News Live, and we're going to be talking a bit about Consortium News and about a past article she did some years ago, which is and an article she did last year, which is very relevant to past guest Whitney Webb's investigation into the whole Epstein network. And yeah, so first off, Ms. Voss, thank you for joining us on One Plus One.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
And and it's a real honor to have you on. And then yeah, so and before we get into the article I wanted to talk to you about, which is very relevant to the country I'm based in, Belgium, talk to people. People who may not actually know about consortium news, and for viewers and listeners, because I try to target, even though like this show is very much like a left-leaning anti-imperialist social justice show, but I do tend to to try to target people who may not know outlets like Min Press News or Consortium News. Talk to us about Consortium News, the founder of Consortium News, the late Robert Parry, and yeah, take it from there.
Sure. Yeah, we just celebrated the 25th anniversary of Consortium News being launched on the internet a few days ago. That was wonderful.
Happy 25th, by the way.
Yeah. And I mean, I've only been associated with Consortium News for a couple of years, but it was great to be part of that celebration. Robert Parry was a renowned journalist. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2018, I believe. And he was really well known for covering and breaking a number of stories on the Iran-Contra scandal in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And he felt he experienced numerous rounds of censorship writing for kind of corporate establishment media. So he decided to just found something that wouldn't be censored. So he founded Consortium News with a number of other journalists that would write for his consortium. And so it just went on from there. He published a lot of good work there over time. And it's been really well known amongst people in the Washington Beltway as a really interesting and good source of information, and also for just anti-establishment truth telling. No, it doesn't. As people were discussing in the 25th anniversary celebration, it doesn't cover things with an ideology first perspective. It looks at the facts. It's critical of a lot of establishment narratives. It also covers things that the establishment just doesn't write about at all. And so in my personal case, the articles that I've written that have been published in Consortium News basically talk about narratives that are not covered enough whatsoever, whether it's human trafficking, or it's something like the DNC fraud lawsuit, which you didn't hear about at all in mainstream press until it was dismissed. So there are lots of different stories that Consortium News publishes and talks about. And then, of course, we have CN Live, which is our webcast that I co-host with Joe Laurier, the editor of Consortium News. And so we cover a lot of things like the Assange hearing recently, WikiLeaks, and all that. So that's a kind of summary.
Yeah, and I really like Consortium News, and before I get into the second question. Yeah, you mentioned Robert Parry, who broke the Iran-Contra scandal, and he did a PBS documentary, one of the only documentaries he did for PBS on Reagan's October surprise. Can you explain to people actually what that was, the Reagan's October surprise, which is sort of linked to the Iran-Contra scandal, but yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I'm so sorry. I'm not really prepared to talk about that today because I thought we were going to talk about Dutrow in Belgium. So since you seem to be very prepared, if you would please give a summary for your audience, that would be fantastic. I can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I think basically like the October surprise was sort of basically like Reagan before he became president actually conspired with Iran to actually keep the hostages that the Iranians took at the U.S. embassy after the Islamic revolution, or after the Shia Islamists hijacked the revolution. And yeah, Robert Parry sort of exposed that. But Just like when he was, covering the Iran-Contra scandal. I mean, he broke the Iran-Contra scandal. Much of, the AP and Newsweek weren't too enthusiastic about it and didn't even really like the fact that he was uncovering all this because of the, Saint Reagan hood that dominated much of the media, right?
Right, exactly. Thank you.
Alrighty, and then before we get into you mentioned Marc Dutroux and that whole scandal. Now Consortium News is also one of the only websites I can think of. I mean, there's Consortium News, World Socialist website, Black Agenda Report, and Minpress News. And Shadowproof and the Grey Zone are one of the only outlets that have not thrown Julian Assange under the bus, not jumped the shark, in supporting the war in Syria, the rabid anti-Russia hysteria, as well as the coup that happened in Ukraine. And why do you think so much of left-leaning media has jumped the shark on those issues?
Well, that's a really big, it's a great question. And I think we could spend a whole hour discussing just that question because I think it has a lot of meat to it. I think some of it is a sense of morality rather than looking at facts. I think that I don't think that everyone in left-wing establishment media has the same exact intent in throwing Assange under the bus or in becoming hysterical about Russia or any of these various issues. Some of them, obviously, in my opinion, have a profit motive, and they're doing it because that's what they're paid to do. If they don't toe the line of their corporate overlords, then they will be fired. There are thousands of people that will take their place without questioning. So there's that, obviously, is a major incentive. The other thing is that I think a number of journalists, I think a lot of journalists nowadays in the corporate media really don't question, and they're not skeptical of power, and they really have an attitude of whatever the authority in the intelligence community tells me must be true. Whatever the paper of record, like the Washington Post, the New York Times, says must be true. So I'm just going to parrot it without questioning. And I think that so you have a situation where by osmosis, a lot of these journalists become brainwashed by their fellow journalist narrative. So you may have some journalists who actually think Assange is a person who he's really not because of these propaganda narratives that have been spread around him. And I mean, we even have people like UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Meltzer, talking about he had been successfully propagandized against Assange. And it was only when he looked into it that he realized what had happened. So I think some people in the media, I'm not trying to let them off the hook, but I think some of them don't realize that they've also been propagandized. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they don't have a responsibility to look deeper into these issues. And so I think that there are a lot of different factors at play, whether it's just a pure profit motive, whether it's unknowing propagandizement, and also type of groupthink that, as I said, comes from more of a sense of morality and a sense of emotion than it does looking at facts factually. So I think a lot of people kind of fell prey to, and I'm not saying this as a conservative by any means, I'm saying this as a former Sanders supporter, that a lot of people, when Trump won, felt that you had to attack Trump by any means necessary because, and so they just lost all perspective. And they lost that ability to kind of look at facts skeptically. And so anybody who was critical of Russiagate then became a supporter of Donald Trump in a lot of people's minds. And so it was kind of it's a mentality that I would associate more with the Salem witch trials or with something that, or the Inquisition, where it's this morality, hysteria, and emotion driving not just authorities but also the media, obviously. But the media that then falsely says that we have 17 intelligence agencies confirming that Russia interfered with the election or hacked the DNC or what have you. It just becomes a circus, and but at the same time, I think it was really the whole Russiagate narrative and that we lived through for 4 years while Trump has been president, has been something that was very educational, not just to me and not just something that kind of brought me into journalism to begin with, but exposed what the media really is all of the time, not just because Trump was president and not just because of Russiagate. I think it really blew the lid off of just how unskeptical of power a lot of journalists are. And for years before that, we had WikiLeaks and we had the publications of Cablegate and all of these other publications that exposed power and the way that the media works enmeshed with power rather than skeptical of it. So we've had waves of this, but I think Russiagate in particular was a really poignant example that has educated people as to what the media really is, but in a way that is really standard but more extreme than usual. It's not something that didn't exist in the 1990s or the 1980s. It's just that in this particular case, it was so much more obvious.
But it's shocking that so much left-leaning media has also jumped the shark. Like, I mean, take Democracy Now. A lot of the not all of the Pacifica outlets, but a lot of the Pacifica networks, and then also other outlets, left-leaning outlets, also jumped the shark on kind of like throwing Assange under the bus, or doing this thing where they smear him before they do defend him. And then, just on Syria and Ukraine, where the founder of Consortium News, Robert Parry, and a lot of the other contributors to Consortium News have debunked that Ukraine was not a bunch of that it wasn't this noble people power revolution against against an oligarch. No, it was a bunch of rival oligarchs. It was a corrupt color revolution financed by many corrupt NGOs that just saw rival oligarchs and a bunch of neo-Nazis get into power.
Oh, absolutely.
And I know that Robert Parry expressed how hurt he was that so many friends and other left-leaning outlets completely marginalized him for that, and also of course debunking all of the anti-Russia nonsense, right?
Absolutely, and it is sad because for speaking out against this installation of a government that's friendly to neo-Nazis, by calling that out, you're labeled a conservative in the U.S. I mean, it's completely topsy-turvy. But again, I think, and this definitely applies to Democracy Now. I mean, even stations like NPR, I think that because of the, I think that there's two things, and I think Assange actually pointed this out. One of the reasons that I think there was so much hatred of Trump that literally deranged some left-leaning media that had done better
Trump
previously.
derangement syndrome, yeah.
Yeah, but one of the reasons for that, I think Assange was really accurate in pointing it out, is it's a class thing. It's that Trump is not civil, he's not polite, he's not, but I mean, yes, he dog whistles racist, absolutely, but there's a deeper gut level reaction amongst I think upper middle class and upper class white liberals, where it's this thing of, ooh, he's uncouth and he's rude and we don't like that. And so it comes from that thing of, if you like Trump, you must be lower class, you must be like WWE fans, so it's a class divide as well as a simple, we don't like his policies. You don't see that around George W. Bush. You don't see that around other conservatives. It's just around Trump. And so I think that fueled that trend of the left media thinking they had to be against Trump morally, by any means necessary, no matter what the facts said in every case. But then you go back and you go back in, though, sadly, to like the Ukraine issue, when it comes to the Obama and the Biden administration, there was just no skeptical lens through which people saw that whatsoever. And so I think regardless, whether it was under Obama or under Trump, the left has really failed in being skeptical of power, skeptical of people on their side, and then also skeptical factually of people like Trump. I mean, the last piece I wrote for Consortium News was about how the media has failed to criticize Trump for going after Assange. And there are legitimate, real scandals that Trump has been part of or been completely at the center of that the media doesn't cover, because although they really hate him viscerally, they don't want to go back on their hatred of Assange. They don't want to have been wrong about calling Assange like Putin's stooge to get Trump elected or whatever else. So I think that the media has, on the left, the media has failed to keep its head. It's failed to be skeptical, and it's really, sadly, I think, a really good example of this would be like the Young Turks, who are kind of a joke now amongst the progressive left. But they started out kind of anti-establishment, and now it's like they're just completely pro-establishment. So I think slowly, for a lot of left media, there is a tendency to start out anti-establishment and then drift into pro-establishment, kind of, again, by osmosis. And once again, for every individual journalist, there can be different motives and different shifts of perception that are involved with that. So you can't label it all as kind of one thing. But it is ultimately, it's very disappointing, and I share the sadness about that. And I wish that left media would support its base, because there are a huge number of progressive people out there that have very good critical thinking skills, that have great skeptical minds, that are really hungry for good media. And so that's why anytime I see a new journalist pop up, I'm so happy, because there need to be more of us that are doing this.
Yeah, it's crazy, but yeah, it's just crazy how much of the pseudo-left has completely exposed themselves, and
exactly, pseudo-left is exactly the word. Yeah,
and with this victory about and with this victory of Joe Biden, am I happy that Trump is gone? Well, yeah, but no, because it's like the winner of the election was not like the American people, and it wasn't people power movement. It was just again rival oligarchs and rival imperialists and mind.
Yeah, and in some ways, to me, as much as I dislike so many of Trump's policies, the tax break, selling off, national public land, just things that are abhorrent to me. The one thing that I thought was a silver lining of that about his presidency was just that he made the unpleasantness, the underside of America in so many different ways. He made it really visible and hard to ignore. And people that were otherwise maybe politically asleep were fired up about things that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise been. So I thought that was a positive. I think a lot of those people are going to go back to sleep now that Biden has won. I think that's not the best thing. And I also think that a lot of the horrible things Trump was doing are going to be continued under Biden, and nobody's going to criticize them. So I think it's actually, and I think I've seen a lot of other progressive news figures write and speak about this, is that it's more dangerous in a presidency under somebody like Biden, because people are not looking at it skeptically in the way that they're even nominally looking at Trump skeptically.
Yeah, I was interviewed by an Eastern European left-leaning outlets, the Barricade, and before the guy was before Boyan asked me the question, what are we going to expect from a Biden administration? He was listing how shocked he was and baffled he was by everybody celebrating Biden's victory, including left-leaning commentators. And I kind of interject, and I said, wow, it's as if it's as if we didn't learn from the Obama years.
Right, and they weren't even trying to sell hope and change this time. They didn't even pretend. And he's literally said things will not really change. That's our slogan. I don't know. Yeah, it's bizarre. It really is.
It's the Frank Zappa song. The torture never stops, and anyways, all those people who think Biden can be pushed to the left and all of that, and all of that bullshit. They need to read Malcolm X's quote, but I'm not going to repeat it there because I'm going to get in trouble.
Okay.
About how, anyways, chumps and traitors to the human race. I'll just, say that.
There you go. Okay.
But okay, now, all right, and then then one last thing is, now. Everybody is saying that that Biden clearly won, but I'm probably going to go a bit out of the limb and say, okay, didn't Biden sort of cheat in order to win? Because on Consortium News Live, you had Whitney Webb, who's been on the show before, and Whitney had wrote an art, had did an investigative piece for her Unlimited Hangout and Last American Vagabond about how basically these, the deep state and all of these rival oligarchs from both the Republicans, like the neocons who think that Trump isn't right-wing enough because he wants detente with, with Russia, and all of these Biden, Obama deep state actors basically, planned, how to usurp the election from Trump in the event that he, clearly had won. And so in a way, because I mean, I was surprised that Joe Biden won, and so isn't there a little bit of truth in in Trump supporters when they say that this election was completely stolen from us?
Well, I've covered a lot of the election rigging and election interference when it comes to the DNC fraud lawsuit, and then also in the congressional races between Tim Canova and Debbie Wasserman Schultz in South Florida. And for those who don't remember, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the DNC chairwoman in 2016, who was revealed by WikiLeaks to have been basically working to ensure that Hillary Clinton would get the 2016 nomination. So because WikiLeaks revealed that, she was forced to resign. So in the same year, you have Tim Canova running in a primary against Debbie Wasserman Schultz in her district, and he lost. And although he did not initially contest the results, he did eventually want to see the ballots and make sure that there wasn't an issue. So what happened was that the Brenda Snipes, the Broward County supervisor of elections, illegally destroyed the ballots in that race, and she was Canova won a summary judgment showing agreeing that she had illegally destroyed those ballots. So we don't know what the results were. So then in 2018, you have Canova running as an independent, so not in the primary this time, as an independent against Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Again, you have poll numbers showing that they're neck and neck by the time that we're getting towards the voting day in the midterms. The results come in, and it's 5% across the board to Canova. 5%. Mm-hmm. That's very. First of all, that's ridiculously low. Second of all, it was not only 5%; it was 5% in every demographic, every single one, the same number. So Canova had election integrity experts look at the numbers, and they said that it was so unlikely it would be like to have that result would be the equivalent of winning the lottery every day for a year to have those numbers. So it was clearly tampered with. There are multiple different ways that type of thing can happen, whether it's the DNC kind of colluding with a particular campaign within a presidential nomination process, or whether it's the people running the election, the vote tabulating and the machinery, or whether it's somebody hacking into the machines. So there can be many, many, many different ways that the elections have serious integrity issues. And it's really sad to me that you have people pointing that out all the way through the 2016 to 2020 kind of time period and talking about this. But as soon as it's Trump that lost, then suddenly those issues don't exist anymore. And that if you talk about them, that you're right wing. So I think so. And so I gave the long preface about the DNC fraud lawsuit, about Tim Canova's race against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, to say these are issues that affect primary races. They're issues that affect congressional races. Primary races on a national level and on a congressional, like a very, very small scale level. But the thing is that they affect, in my opinion, both parties. I've never, I don't have the expertise to sit here and point out exactly how there may have been some sort of rigging or interference in this particular election, because to do so on a national level would be a huge amount of organization. I mean, it would be a huge thing to not only do, but for a journalist to then kind of try to prove had happened would be a really massive undertaking. So I'm not going to try and say, yes, it was 100% rigged, or definitely 100% wasn't. But what I do think we can very fairly assess, just by looking at the facts that we have available to us, is that there are questions about election integrity that have been going on for years, and that those don't stop just because the person you dislike lost. And that doesn't mean that it was definitely rigged, but it does mean that there are questions, and that those questions, we really do need to have not only a fairer, but a more secure voting system in place. In Germany, they have paper ballots, hand counted in public. We need that in the United States. But unfortunately, when you ask, well, that doesn't sound that hard to implement, why don't we have that? Well, because it's unriggable. And that's the problem. That's why they don't have it. So, I mean, whether or not this particular election was quote unquote stolen, I can't say. But I can say that I don't think any of our elections are 100% secure. But I'll add that I don't think it's people like the Russians who are the ones that would be hacking our elections, it's going to be people who have the most to gain from those elections, and that's going to be domestic actors.
Yeah, and the U.S. is an oligarchy, and when you live in an oligarchy, you basically just have rival oligarchs at each other's throats and all trying to find different ways to cheat the other. I do think that that the deep state and certainly played some kind of a role in making sure that Trump didn't get it this time around, yeah, that's definitely
and Whitney's and to add on to that, I just want to address Whitney's article, which I loved, and I was so glad to talk to her briefly about that. Yeah. I think that it's very likely that the establishment did not want Trump to win, because he has been, although he hasn't entirely ended any wars, he didn't start any. I mean, I criticized him when he did the $100 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, but it's just that, although a warmonger, because, he's kind of like the least warmongering president we've had in a while, which means the establishment, especially the military industrial complex, does not like that. So it makes sense to me that type of thing and the type of issues that Whitney brought up would be in play. And she, pretty much exactly what she described is what's played out. So yeah, I don't think that makes anybody conservative for recognizing that.
And yeah, it's just shocking, and it's just shocking how so many are just saying, Biden won fair and square and so forth. But there you go, the pseudo left for you.
Yeah, exactly.
And okay, so on to on to the article I really want to talk to you about, and that's about the Marc Dutroux affair. Now, like I said, I live in Belgium, and I was completely, really shocked when I read this article. I think it was sometime last year, and and I was rereading it a couple of months ago, especially in the context of the whole Epstein scandal that Whitney Webb exposed. And you even did some articles, kind of digging a little bit deeper into what two documentaries about the Epstein affair completely left out. And you mentioned Dutrow, and you had actually you even had done an article about how, about the CIA's long sword involvement and the state itself's involvement in the sexual abuse of children, human trafficking, and so forth. But before we get into that, for people who don't know, apart from probably a Belgian audience, the Marc Dutroux scandal. Talk to us about the Marc Dutroux scandal and what WikiLeaks actually helped expose about that whole affair.
So, excuse me. So basically, in trying to open up this story to a non-Belgian audience, the best way I can do that is to bring in the Epstein scandal first, because most people are going to be aware of that. So basically, in summarizing that, the Marc Dutroux story is very, very similar in a lot of really crucial ways to the Epstein story. A number of those parallels include the fact that Epstein, and that's what I looked at, and that's why I brought up Dutroux in my coverage of Epstein and those documentaries, was that the documentaries about Epstein that have come out from Netflix and from Investigation Discovery that have basically portrayed him as a lone nut figure, a lone predator, and an aberration from the norm. So they've gone, the basic question of those is, my goodness, how did this happen? How did this guy do all of this and not get prosecuted?
Yeah, there was also, and there's also, just to interject, there was also, the ridiculous response of, Bill Clinton and people like Jerry Wexler, who Maria Farmer, a victim of the Epstein trafficking, said was the head of the snake. And, you see, press conferences there. I had no idea that Jeffrey Epstein was doing all this stuff. I was just so charmed by him. And
what a talented guy, no, really. And so basically you had that question of, how did he get so rich, and how did he get away with all of this without being prosecuted? Oh, our system failed, whoops. And the thing is that a similar situation happened in Dutroux, where you have this man who is basically caught murdering young girls, had kidnapped young girls. I believe he had 6 total, 4 of whom died, 2 survived. And that was thanks to a particular judge that those two, that was, was the aberration from that norm in the sense that he was not corrupt. That is really the reason those 2 girls did end up being released alive, in my opinion. But in that particular situation, you had the Belgian and the media in the Western world in general kind of coalescing around this narrative that Marc Dutroux is this lone nutcase, this lone monster who was psychotic, and this guy was just nuts, and and they really, in both cases, the media, you can see this conflict that they have. They really want to get viewership and readership through latching on to the kind of sordid details of each case, but they don't want to actually look further into why these cases happened, what the real situation was. And so that's what I was discussing in the stuff about Epstein and these documentaries about Epstein. So you have the presentation of Epstein and earlier in Belgium of Marc Dutroux as these lone nuts. And then in the reality of the situation in both cases is that they were cogs in a larger network. It's very clear that that was the case. There is a lot of evidence to that effect. And obviously, you've had Whitney on before. Whitney Webb has done a great job documenting that and going into great detail and great depth on Epstein's connections to various underworld figures, intelligence figures, et cetera, et cetera. And what I've looked at a little bit specifically in rebutting some of the Netflix coverage of Epstein was just saying, look, he was clearly intelligence. I mean, obviously. He was, a better way to put it, he was definitely working with intelligence. That's why he was protected. We had Acosta, Trump's former labor secretary, defending his decision to give Epstein a sweetheart plea deal by saying, well, I was told to keep my hands off. He belonged to intelligence. Sorry. So you have a lot of indication of that. In the Dutroux case, it was less about intelligence as it was establishment political figures who had ties to then the underworld. And so Marc Dutroux was part of that underworld in Belgium. And his particular point of contact in that underworld was Nihul. And Nihul was basically, he called himself the monster of Belgium. He was, a number of witnesses saw him with Dutroux at these orgies and basically torture parties that would happen. There was the allegation that there was a lot of snuff films being made, and there was a whole lot of just horrendous activities going on that were being used allegedly to blackmail the establishment figures. And so although there was not so much an indication in my research anyway of, especially not a U.S. intelligence agency involvement in the Dutroux case, you do have, again, this underage sexual abuse. You have, pedophilia, torture, all these different things being used as blackmail. In the Epstein case, you also have, obviously, illegal sexual activity being used allegedly as blackmail. So the existence of a larger network, the use of blackmail, those are things that both cases really share. And these are not the only 2 examples of their kind. What they show together is that this is a historical trend, that this is a pattern, that it's something that happens, that reoccurs, even though, so for example, the fact that the Epstein case was more intelligence linked than Dutroux shows that it's not even the same agencies that are sort of creating this environment in which this happens. It seems to be something that goes along with powerful and elite power structures that sort of that this seems to recur. I don't want to say over and over again, but in different situations, different parts of the world. And so basically it's the shadow of power that we have to kind of reckon with, that most people don't know about. I think the public in general has a good sense of power being corrupt, of our politicians in general not really representing us, that they represent the rich and powerful. But I don't think most of us understand just how dark power gets the more that you have of it. And I think that, so in Belgium, in the Marc Dutroux case, it was more centered around, rather than intelligence as in the Epstein case, Dutroux case implicated the Belgian aristocracy. It implicated some Willie Claes, who was a very powerful NATO figure who was corrupt and resigned eventually for involvement in a different corruption scandal. it was a case that ultimately was deconstructed in the media by attacking the credibility of witnesses. So instead of addressing the evidence that had been brought forward, what the media did was it tried to make witnesses look crazy and unbelievable, and it ignored the evidence that Dutrow was working with other people. So by the end of the whole saga, you had Dutrow basically, again, being portrayed as a lone nut, witnesses being portrayed as crazy, and everybody just kind of moved on as if nothing had happened eventually. However, in the process of the whole scandal unfolding, you did have Western media outlets, especially in the beginning and middle of the whole situation. They did admit that investigators and police in Belgium were looking into other contacts that Marc Dutroux had. They admitted that they thought he was part of a larger network. And so this is where WikiLeaks comes in too. So WikiLeaks was founded much later, after the Dutroux scandal had already died down. Marc Dutroux was already in prison. But they published a dossier and a lot of documents that were related to the Dutroux case. They're basically police records. And what those showed, I mean, it's a huge number of them. I mean, but what they show is that there are pictures of Nuhul, apologies for my pronunciation, with a lot of different political figures, although they don't go into who those figures are. There are indications that that Dutroux himself was trying to dump bodies in a body of water in a car and needed help from his brother to do that. There was a whole lot of evidence that the public had not had access to, that WikiLeaks published, that really corroborated the allegations of these witnesses that Dutroux was obviously not acting alone. And we can get more into the details of that, like the fact that Dutroux was on, I believe, the equivalent of Social Security benefits in Belgium at the time that he was arrested, and yet he had 10 houses and a very substantial amount of money in he and his wife's bank accounts. So there was a whole lot of other information like that that's more specific. But in a general sense, the Dutroux scandal is, as far as its skeleton, in a skeleton kind of a way, it is very similar to the Epstein scandal, but obviously in a different part of the world and in decades apart.
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. I mean, now I don't speak French or Flemish, so any like reports about Marc Dutroux, I have to have like my parents kind of like translate when there is a documentary about it. But basically, yeah. So Marc Dutroux was basically like this serial pedophile killer. It wasn't just that he was like kidnapping and raping these young girls, but he had like a dungeon where he even where he even tortured and murdered some of them. His wife was an accomplice and allowed two girls to basically scream themselves to death and starve to death. Really like horrendous really like horrendous shit. But the narrative that's come out and what my parents were saying was that was that the reason why it took so long for like the Belgian authorities to capture this guy, put him in the jail, was just incompetence. And there is a lot of truth to that. Like the police were grossly incompetent, which was why the Belgian public was so outraged at it. But what shocked me when I read your article and how WikiLeaks kind of vindicates all of the stuff that you were explaining was that, no, this is not just gross incompetence, gross criminal negligence of the highest order. The Belgian authorities were covering up covering up something, and it gets into a very disturbing world of human trafficking, sexual trafficking, in which a lot of the Belgian elites, Belgian politicians, major parties were all very much implicated in that. But it seems as if, as you mentioned, that there was this growing, media, that the Belgian media, and still to this day, hence why, I'm repeating, that it was just, a lone pedophile with his crazy accomplice wife, and just the police were incompetent. But WikiLeaks basically vindicates the arguments that people and whistleblowers and even past victims of Dutrow were saying that, no, this is something deeper, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yes. And I think that it's really, when you then, in retrospect, in light of that WikiLeaks material, when you look at the way that Regina Louf, her life was basically, I mean, dissected by the media, it makes you realize how horrendous that was. And I think that, and she was a credible witness. I'll also add that, you mentioned the language barrier, and I mean, I only speak English, so it's difficult. I mean, the news articles that I have access to, I can Google Translate French and I can Google Translate some things, but there is still a language barrier. And so I think that that's one of the obstacles into looking into these stories from a Western perspective, is that, sometimes there are stories that are incredibly rich with evidence, but you're not able to have access to it. I know there are actually some other stories very much like the Dutrow one, but that there's almost no information that's in English. It's all in French. So, I think that unfortunately, this type of thing is a lot more common than we'd like to admit. But yes, the Dutrow scandal, they basically wanted to portray him, like Epstein, as having gotten away with this murder and these murders, rapes, as you say, as a result of this incompetence. And I remember that one of the stories was that the police, I believe, had failed to watch videotapes that they already had in custody of Dutrow constructing the dungeon that he kept these girls in. They also, and I maybe, and it's been years since I wrote this, so forgive me if I misstate this part of it, but I believe that there were police that went to the door of Dutrow, who went into his house, and that they heard muffled screaming as well.
Yeah,
and
screaming.
They chose to walk away and not investigate that. And I believe that the police officer in particular who did that, who chose to walk away, was, instead of kind of being kicked out and fired for his incompetence that may have resulted in 2 little girls' death, he was promoted. So it's not, I mean, even if you could put that down to incompetence, why is that guy being promoted? So it's you can definitely see that there obviously is incompetence at one level. Now, why does that incompetence occur is a different question. You also had the failure to test the DNA from the cells that they found in Dutrow's basement. There were lots of hair samples that were clearly indicating that multiple people had been there other than just Dutrow and his wife. So then the question is, who were they? Why were those samples not tested? Like, that's not, at that point, it's not even, when the police recognized that there were hair samples that were not Dutrow or his wife's, that's confirmation that there are other people there. But the fact that they haven't tested it and they won't identify who that was doesn't negate the fact that it confirms there are other people present. Yeah, you had the removal of Judge Conrot, who was a really, really good judge who had a lot of integrity, who was calling out some of the corruption around this case. He was summarily removed from the case, and that I believe that there was a very large march in the streets because of him being removed from the case, called the White March. I think it was around 300,000 people in Belgium who marched, and it wasn't just. And what's really important to communicate about that, at least from my recollection of my research about this, was that it wasn't simply the fact that there was a sense of corruption. It was specifically because this really good judge had been removed. You also had the death of a prosecutor who was involved who was overseeing the Dutrow case, as well as another kind of gangland killing, the Coors scandal, Cools scandal. Sorry. Basically, so that prosecutor was found. They had allegedly shot himself, I believe. So it was labeled a suicide, but it was it's one of those situations where it's questionable as to whether that was a suicide or a murder. And so the Dutrow scandal kind of bleeds over into a number of other scandals. And another thing to add as well that kind of fleshes out the fact that it wasn't simply police incompetence in the Dutrow case, was the fact that there were over 20 or more deaths that were very, very mysterious. So you can't just have police incompetence creating these mysterious deaths. I mean, there's something beyond that goes into that. I mean, and when I say mysterious deaths, I don't mean alleged suicides alone, I mean, people burning in their beds, scooters going into in having car wrecks. It was just, there were a litany of different people dying in really bizarre ways. I think one person was poisoned, and they were all witnesses in the Dutrow case. So, I mean, the evidence that there is, even as an only English speaker, being able to look at this evidence, even the evidence that is available to me, was very clear that there was a cover-up of the case, that Dutrow was working with more, was not working alone, that he was part of a network, and that network was politically connected, because you wouldn't have a cover-up like this unless it wasn't.
And what's also crazy, we forgot to mention, was that before Dutrow kidnapped the 6 girls, in which only 2 survived, but we don't even know if there were even more victims because of all the things that you mentioned. Now, he was convicted of, but he was previously convicted of,
rape.
Yeah, yes. Talk about that.
Yeah, so he was previously convicted of rape. He was imprisoned for it, and he was let out early, which was another reason that people protested, because he was allowed to be let out early, which allowed him to reoffend again, and it was after being released early from prison that he committed these later 6 kidnappings, 4 murders. So, and there is no telling how many other victims he had, just in terms of abuse and sourcing this network. And that's another parallel you see with Epstein, is that Epstein was involved with thousands of girls, or at least hundreds, probably thousands. So you have this characterization of Epstein as kind of funding the elite with just an unending stream of young girls to abuse. And so Dutrow, if you get into the story and you really look at it, looks to have been in that same situation, that he was kind of part of a trafficking network that was providing a large number of girls for the purpose of this creation of blackmail, of torture, et cetera, on and on. So it's definitely not something where the 4 deaths were the only ones that were implicated in the story. However, they were not, the establishment media doesn't want to recognize that. And like Epstein, it wants to focus in on the one particular thing he was caught on.
And shocking that that RTBF actually campaigned to smear the person who, one of the victims of Dutrow, and his co-conspirator Nihal, I think, was the guy that you mentioned. But RTBF, yeah, basically, was like, was smearing her, and it got to a point where any of the victims of Dutrow, when they would speak up and say that this was, a state crime, basically, they were all basically targeted and smeared, right?
Absolutely, they were completely dismantled, especially Regina Luth, who was known as X1. Yeah, she was known as X1. The group of women who came forward were known as the X Witnesses. And I'm really grateful, there was only one website where I was able to find a translation of their testimony. It's very hard to find their testimony. There have been a few books written in Dutch, and I think there's a translation of that book in French, but there hasn't been a translation of it in English yet. And but nonetheless, I was able to find at least one translation of a lot of their testimony, not all of it. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to read it. One of the really interesting things and the really shocking things about Regina's testimony is that despite the fact that she was absolutely just taken apart by the media, she was an extremely credible witness. I believe it was Regina who described the inside of one of the houses that she'd been present at during these torture, sexual abuse, and murder parties, and that she described a young girl, being murdered in a particular way that I believe involved like ropes and strangulation and that type of thing. And in that particular instance, it was the inside of that house where that occurred had been converted into some kind of mushroom farm or mushroom growing setup. And the police later corroborated that an unsolved murder had taken place in that building exactly as she described. And they said, this is not, you couldn't make up having been in that building. It was very distinct. I mean, you don't just like make up being in a building in the inside of a mushroom farm and, the specific way that this woman, young girl, was killed. So, in other words, Regina was not somebody who was just making things up for attention. She had very credible testimony. The problem is, and what made it easy for the media to kind of tear apart, was the fact that, and this is one of the things that's a little bit different to the Epstein story. In the Epstein story, you mostly have girls describing sexual abuse, which is absolutely horrendous, but they don't describe, from what I understand, they don't describe things like torture and murder. Whereas in this Belgian story, in the Dutrow case, you have Regina and the other ex-witnesses describing extreme acts of torture, rape, murder, all sorts of, and at times,
I mean, like sexual orgies, but then also like torture involved in it, and them engaging in kind of like satanic,
right. Which then that's because of
really vicious crimes,
and because of the and some of the allegations, and I don't remember exactly which ex-witness this was, but I know that a couple of them described going to mansions and castles where the Belgian aristocracy were, and basically there were entire events at these locations where some of this happened. So you have lurid details that the media found very easy on one hand to profit from, but on the other hand found it easy to just completely amputate Regina's credibility because of the fact that these were such lurid allegations. So it became really easy to defame her and defame anybody who talked about it, and basically, label them crazy conspiracy theorists, et cetera, and hysterical. And what that did was it just silenced the whole thing. It never really, from my understanding, the scandal itself never really had a satisfactory conclusion for people. I mean, Dutrow was imprisoned, but ultimately, Michel Mahul was not prosecuted. He wasn't imprisoned. He was, he basically got off scot-free, and he told The Guardian he would get off scot-free. He said, "I'm the monster of Belgium, and I'm untouchable." And he was right. He was never punished. So much less than the people he was connected to.
And did any of the incompetent police, did any of them lose their jobs?
No, not to my knowledge. The only changes in jobs that I read about were the promotions, unfortunately. So you had the people who were responsible, at least in part, for a lot of this, who were promoted or never prosecuted, and you have the victims of this being completely ridiculed. And other than that, you just have kind of, as I said in the article, you just have silence that falls over the whole thing, and everybody just moves on as if it hasn't happened. And so the reason I think it's important to talk about these historical rings is because it informs the present. So when we're looking at an Epstein or whatever future iteration of this that will inevitably, unfortunately, happen, we have to know that there is this larger context. And I mean, there are other cases too that are less about the aristocracy and again more about intelligence agencies, like the Kincora Boys' Home scandal in Belfast. You had all sorts of different scandals across the globe like this. And so, unfortunately, if we don't understand that this is the norm rather than a psychotic aberration of one lone criminal, then we won't be able to even have any hope whatsoever of stopping it, preventing it, and identifying it before it ruins the lives of thousands of victims.
Yeah, and actually, and before we talk about those other ones that that you mentioned, which I want to get into, talk briefly about talk briefly about how when WikiLeaks got their hands on this to sort of vindicate that that this was a huge trafficking network that implicated a lot of the Belgian elites. The Belgian authorities tried to block WikiLeaks from exposing it and for media outlets reporting it, or what?
Right. Yeah. No, you basically summed it up. Basically, so WikiLeaks, I believe, published the Dutrow material in 2009. In 2010, The Belgium government tried to force WikiLeaks to remove the information. They completely failed in that effort, but they did try to. So you can view that even so. 2009 was a good number of years after this scandal had died down. So, but even then, you have aspects of the Belgian government trying to shut down coverage of this story. I mean, that's incredible to me.
Wow.
But WikiLeaks was able to publish this. They were able to keep it online for people, and I would encourage your viewers to go take a look at it. It's a lot of documentation, but if you just scan it briefly, you'll understand that there's no way that this was a single lone predator. Because not only do you have the stuff that I mentioned earlier about Dutrow asking his brother to help, put a body-laden car into I think a lake or a river. You also have descriptions of various different currencies that Dutrow had in his possession. You have evidence reference where Dutrow is referencing reducing or trafficking girls with Nahul, and and talking about how they were going to get those girls from Eastern Europe. I mean, it's a trove of very valuable documentation from WikiLeaks. And I think, broadening out the discussion a little bit just to WikiLeaks itself, it's one of the lesser known publications that they've done, but it goes to show, in my opinion, how valuable WikiLeaks is as an operation and as an organization, in the terms of the fact that it publishes documentation that affects so many different kinds of stories. WikiLeaks is most well known for the collateral murder video. It's most well known for publications relating to the Afghan war, the Iraq war, and then later on for the DNC and Podesta emails. But essentially, WikiLeaks has covered thousands of different kinds of stories in the publications that it's given to the public. So they're incredibly valuable.
They should get the Nobel Peace Prize. Hashtag just saying.
Yeah. So the value of WikiLeaks and what it's done is it's incalculable. It's immense. And just in this story alone, they've done something priceless in corroborating these victims' testimonies, essentially, who had had their reputations utterly destroyed. And so, I think that I hope that in future, witnesses in various types of scandals like this will be able to have their voices heard without being so successfully torn to pieces by the media. I hope that slowly things will change where we don't have the media simply looking at them and blaming the victim in these situations. I think that the Epstein scandal has been a little bit of a step in the right direction, because even in the documentaries that were essentially covering up that Epstein was connected to intelligence, they did the one good thing they did was that they let the victim speak, and they didn't try to assassinate their character. And so I'll give them that. And I hope, I can't say this will be the case, but I hope that moving forward, that at least that's a trend that we'll see more of, and less of the character assassination that we saw in the Dutrow scandal.
But the media's silence on the Dutrow scandal in Belgium, I think, I think they certainly are. I mean, if they're not, I mean, they're probably not smearing. Well, I mean, they are smearing WikiLeaks, but in different ways. Because the Belgian media and the European media often just recycles that Assange is guilty of some kind of a sexual crime in Sweden and all that stuff. But on Dutrow, the media still is covering up for the crimes of the state, because it was just from reading your article on the fact that WikiLeaks actually exposed this, and not much of the Belgian media and other French and Dutch-speaking media are reporting on this. That's crazy in and of itself. And the one last thing I have to also mention about the Dutrow scandal is that the Belgian authorities continue to sort of stick their thumb in the eyes of the victims, because Dutrow's wife actually was paroled and actually got out of prison. She got housed by a bunch of some Catholic nun organization, and just completely outrageous. And then you keep thinking to yourself, why on earth would the Belgian government do this? But then now it all makes perfect sense once you read your article, once you dig into what WikiLeaks exposed, and you even read into past documentaries outside of Belgium, that I mean, this is more than just gross incompetence and just a stupid judicial system doesn't work. No, they were complicit, and yeah, just crazy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that the details of this story are all really damning. I mean, you just go through the list, and it's mind blowing. And I think that one of the reasons that people haven't heard of this scandal, although I mean, in some ways, it's far more explosive than the Epstein case, although it's not as directly tied to intelligence. I mean, the types of crimes that were going on were just unbelievable. So the reason I think as well, in addition to the fact that the media sort of just clamped down on the story over the years, but the reason that I think that it hasn't gotten more coverage and there isn't that much awareness about it in the US is also because it just happened, too many decades before the age of the internet. I think that most people are not, the internet. If the internet had existed when the Dutrow scandal occurred, then we would have had a completely different chain of events. I think that there would have been a huge amount of disclosure about what was actually going on in that case. With the Epstein scandal, although a lot of the stories originate from kind of the earlier era of the internet, it's been a lot more open. You have people like Whitney Webb, reporting on the details of it and the historical background of Epstein and his associates. I think that that's another silver lining we can see that's different to the Dutrow case, or at least is hopefully something that will be a positive difference, is that, if and when a Dutrow type scandal occurs again, that there will be independent investigators who are not paid, who just want to seek the truth, who will be able to go and look at the details and publish them freely. And you won't have that kind of establishment mouthpiece, media, echo chamber monopoly on the information that's given to the public, because that was so instrumental in shutting down the Dutrow scandal and the coverage of it.
And that is a perfect segue, because talking about Epstein and talking about how the state, was very much partners in crime to Dutrow, who was kind of like their project manager to these sinister crimes against humanity. Talk about in one of your articles when you were talking about Epstein, about how this is not an aberration, that human rights abuse that the CIA has engaged in, a human trafficking, sexual blackmail operation. Talk about the other scandals that you mentioned and the deep state's involvement in that. So you mentioned one in Northern Ireland, right. Two in the U.S. Yeah, take it from there.
Yeah. So basically, you have the one I mentioned earlier was the Kincora boys' home scandal in Belfast in Northern Ireland, and that was allegedly maybe orchestrated isn't the right word, but it was alleged that MI6 was very aware of that abuse of boys in that home, and that there was blackmail going on in that case around the the political situation in Northern Ireland. So that's where it was centered in a small location rather than very international in the way that Epstein's case was, where you had Israeli intelligence, you had U.S. intelligence, you had people from all sorts of different countries engaging in this abuse with these children that Epstein had. So they're different in that sense. But in terms of the intelligence aspect, that's where a lot of these cases that I talked about in a different article that I think you're referencing, that's where a lot of these cases have a commonality. So the Dutrow case doesn't fit so much into this pattern, but you have the Franklin scandal in Nebraska. You have the Finders case that was based in sort of Washington, D.C. and Florida, which was linked allegedly to the CIA. And then you had the Belfast situation with the Kincora boys' home linked to MI6. And so you have a whole lot of these different cases that occurred anywhere from the late 70s through the 80s, onto today in terms of the Epstein case, where you have allegations that that various intelligence agencies of various different countries have been aware of or participated in the organized sexual abuse of minors, usually for the creation of blackmail. Now, in the Finders case, there was a lot of really bizarre material that was discussed in a memo by U.S. Customs Special Agent Ramon Martinez.
And what was the Finders scandal?
So the Finders scandal was a situation where you had, I believe, a number of children were found in Florida, in Tallahassee. They were, the police were called to a public park because the children were just very, very unkempt. They looked neglected, and they were with two men in suits. And so the police were called. The police assumed that the children had been kidnapped, so they took them into custody. They took the two men into custody, and basically the insanity began at that point. What it turned out was that the two men were members of this cult called the Finders. The children were not the biological children of these two men, but they were the biological children of members of the Finders cult. So they had not been, in a technical sense, they had not been kidnapped. The mothers knew where their children were going and that type of thing. But what's really remarkable is that despite the clear neglect of these children, the children were returned to the parents' custody, and no charges were, and there was no prosecution. Now, the police, the authorities at the time, basically ended up saying, well, this Finders group is just an alternative living community, and they have different ways of raising their children. It was kind of like the equivalent of Dutrow was a lone nut. End of story. Nothing more to see here. But the reality was that and this is, from very credible news reports at the time, like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they reported that the Tallahassee police reported that there had been evidence of sexual abuse in at least some of the children. They also said that the children did not know what it was to be indoors. That in Washington, D.C., where it gets cold in the winter, that they were kept outside at all times. They were not raised indoors. That they were being given raw fruit and vegetables. They were not being given normal food in any sort of way. So can you imagine a situation in Washington, D.C., where you have a child being raised outdoors like a dog, and they decide not to take that child into protective or, government type of custody? It would be unimaginable. But in this case, those children were returned to their parents. And that's aside from any of the more bizarre information that came out in the story. I mean, just on its face, those children should not have been returned to that situation. They didn't know, they had not been taught to use the bathroom. They hadn't been, they were completely amazed at a stapler and a telephone. They didn't know what these objects were. And this was, the oldest, I think, was like 6 or 7. So it was obviously a really brutal situation for these kids. They were covered in insect bites and dirt, and they were just very, very neglected in a very obvious way. So what happened, though, is that when investigators in Washington, D.C. looked at some of these Finders compounds and locations where they had, I believe, at least one house, and then they had a warehouse, and they also had a farm outside in Virginia. Okay, so they went to these locations, and Ramon Martinez documented that he saw photographs of, nude photographs of the children, photographs of the Finders cult members engaged in sexual activity, photographs of the children being exposed to some sort type of ritual slaughter of a goat, all of this very bizarre stuff. He also saw a room that he said looked like it had been set up for some sort of indoctrination. He didn't elaborate on what that meant, and he said there were like jars of urine and feces on the ground and all of this very, very weird stuff. What's very interesting to me is that then later on, and this is something that I'm going to be writing about in future, is that now we have not, and this is about a year or so after I initially wrote about the Finders as part of this larger piece on the intelligence linked to multiple different child trafficking rings. You have the FBI has published a number of different document dumps on the Finders, and what it shows is that these documents going, well, they redact Ramon Martinez's name, but they basically say, well, this guy who claims to have seen this stuff, he's totally wrong. But those documents in which they say that are classified, which is exactly what Martinez said happened. He said all the files associated, all the investigation has been rendered classified, and it's been
in other words,
deep
state is
a CIA internal matter. Yeah, and so even in the documents where they're saying, "Oh, this guy is wrong," and we don't know what he's talking about, it is actually a corroboration of what he said in terms of the fact that it was classified. They also admitted in these new documents that they couldn't find the evidence. They had not cataloged the evidence that Martinez described, but they didn't. But also, they didn't even have numbers for the amount of evidence. They didn't have the names of the police officers who compiled the evidence. So everything that would have been allowed you to corroborate what Ramon says he saw is gone, according to these documents. And so again, that, I mean, to me, looking at these types of cases, that says this is corroboration of what he said, in my opinion, in my take on that. So I should get back to what he saw, because the stuff that he saw wasn't only in relation to child abuse and child neglect and that type of thing. He also saw documents that were very, very damning. They basically talked about the trafficking of children via the Chinese embassy, talked about kidnapping, explosives, all sorts of just bizarre, out there stuff. They had information about not only child trafficking, but basically they had a file labeled like Pentagon break-in. They had files on how to evade police while transporting the children and that type of thing. I mean, it was extensive. But the most interesting thing, at least to me, was that they had documentation that passports for Finders members to places, and this is in the midst of the Cold War. The Finders were investigated in the late 80s, I believe it was 1987, but they had passports dating from the 50s through the 70s to places like North Korea, to Russia, to go to Moscow, to northern Vietnam, to places that you would not have been able to go unless you had been somehow associated with intelligence and with government work. Later on, you do have confirmation that the leader of the Finders'Cult, Marion Petty, his wife was a CIA asset. She was working for the CIA. So those were her passports. Those were that she was working for them. I believe Marion Petty's son also worked for Air America, which was a huge part of the CIA's, drug running and Iran-Contra type activities. So you have multiple connections between the leader of this group, and the CIA, and you have this really bizarre activity going on with it. So that's one example of these type of situations where you have what appears to be obvious child abuse connected to the intelligence agencies, which is then covered up. I don't know if I've kind of skipped over anything because it's just such a bizarre case. It's hard to know.
The police are able to, obtain these photos because that all goes back to the fact that this is part of the whole sexual blackmail stuff that any of those CIA front or those CIA related groups engage in, right?
Yeah, and I think what comes out because I've tried to look the best I can through all of these FBI documents they've published so far, and what sort of becomes apparent is that the Tallahassee police in Florida initially were like, this is child abuse, and they were trying to prosecute it. Then the DC police kind of come in and kind of communicate that this is kind of untouchable, stop. And so then things get confused. And eventually you have, so Martinez is a member of is working for Customs. So he's not a member of the DC Metropolitan Police Department, obviously. And so he comes in and basically is trying to follow up just on his report. And he's told to talk to, he has a contact within the Washington Metro Police Department that he's supposed to talk to. That person cancels on him, but then he speaks to a third party who basically tells him that this has become a CIA internal matter, that's off the record now, that it's completely classified, that there's going to be no more action to be taken on this, et cetera, et cetera. And it seems to be that the Washington Police Department is kind of where there was some level of cover-up or awareness that this was not to be touched.
Wow. Oh Jesus, the CIA. They really do take evil always to like a whole nother level. That's just what stuns me so much about the CIA, and I think both Doug Valentine and Whitney Webb are right. The CIA really does run like it really does operate like organized crime, but
absolutely.
But at the same time, I mean, like, wow, I mean, it really just takes evil to like a whole nother level, because you think of that and you think of Dutrow and the fact that that so much of the Belgian of the Belgian establishment were engaging in this, and then you just think to yourself, wow, how can people still tolerate these institutions, and how come there has just not been, this revolution, apart from, a few public outcries against what the CIA, does sometimes, and of course what happened with, the big protests in Belgium. But wow, it's just amazing though how these elites get away with it though.
It's almost like it almost seems to be that the fact that it's so bizarre and so out there kind of is it's an insulating and protective quality, because it's anybody who looks at it, who researches it, who talks about it, whether they're victims and witnesses or whether they're investigative journalists or whoever, can very easily be dismissed as conspiracy theorist or as a whatever. And so I think that there's that aspect of it that's then coupled by the public, very rightfully recoiling from how awful this all is. Nobody really wants, most people do not want to think that this type of thing is going on, especially not in a way that's kind of common or basically a part of the norm for as far as Western power structures go. We want to think of things like, we want the most horrendous events in history, like, I don't know, the Holocaust or the Spanish Inquisition, these things that were really just the worst that humanity is capable of. We want those to be bygone eras of history that we're never going to revisit again. And to think that that these horrendous events can happen again, that they, in some cases, are happening to the most vulnerable elements of society, people do not want to think that's possible. And so, in a sense, the public kind of unwittingly colludes with the media in turning a blind eye and kind of going, okay, you're right, that victim must be crazy, let's just go talk about something else. It's really, and it's understandable to not want to have to look into these stories, but I think that the public has to change that mindset, and in understanding that by recoiling from these stories, we're kind of allowing victims to just completely go unheard. We're allowing the perpetrators to continue, and we're allowing the media to get away with helping those perpetrators to continue what they're doing. And I don't know, I asked Whitney Webb a few times, because we've interviewed her on Consortium News Live, and I asked her, well, what do you think the next iteration of this Epstein ring will look like? And she talked about the way that technology has changed things, the way the internet's changed things. But obviously, she can't just predict like a name or a person that's going to kind of carry Epstein's torch. But I hope that when that next iteration of that operation is exposed, that we'll do a better job as a public and as independent media in covering it from the beginning and not waiting 10 or 20 years to talk about it.
Yeah, because it seems because I think sort of expanding on what you were saying is I was having a conversation with somebody who was interviewing me, and I got into a very big conversation with one of my best friends, Julia, about coronavirus, and we were kind of sort of getting into the whole did the government come up with this, and I was kind of like saying, well, I've not seen any evidence that the government came up with coronavirus, but I will just say this. Just looking at the Epstein scandal alone, and how you have organized crime, the deep state, the FBI, the UK deep state, the Israeli deep state, and people in the entertainment and fashion industry all colluding together to traffic innocent young girls or people of whatever age, just so that they can do a sexual blackmail operation, so that they can continue imperialism, not in Palestine and elsewhere. That's the government taking evil to a whole nother ballpark. And why there isn't more public outcry, I don't know. I don't get it. I think it goes back to what you were saying, that I think people like to think that, oh, it's just Republicans that do evil things, so therefore it can be reformed. And that's, if you take just the issue of just, police state murder that happens all the time in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, in the Nordic countries and so forth, people think like, oh, well, it's just a few bad apples. But the police, they really are there to protect us, and we do need the police to fight crime, even though they're engaged in so much crime, and that these institutions can be reformed. And do you think that's why that even with the Epstein scandal, there still is, a see no evil, speak no evil, and and hear no evil?
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think that it reminds me a lot of the dynamic where, in a family, you could have somebody disclosing abuse, and the partner of the person who might be abusing says, well, don't, just they kind of shush the victim and like, no, don't talk about that. We don't, because the person doesn't want to have their narrative of the person they're with shattered. I think that's what a lot of people have in regards to institutions of power, because we want to trust those things. We want to trust that the police are there to protect us and keep the, evil robbers and would-be murderers or whoever, out of our houses and out of our lives. And the reality, as shown by many of these stories, is it's the complete opposite. And no, I think it makes people uncomfortable because it makes them feel powerless. Well, if I can't trust the police, or if I can't trust my governing authorities, if I can't trust the intelligence agencies that are trying to keep the country safe, then who can I trust? And I feel out of control, because where am I going to give my authority to? And I think ultimately what that comes down to is the fact that people have put their inner locus of control outside of themselves, and they want to have something take care of them in the sense that they're safe in doing that. And it forces them to say, no, I'm really kind of on my own, or me and my loved ones and my community, we're kind of on our own here. And, it's an unfortunate reality, but my attitude towards it all, no matter what the issue is, whether it's the coronavirus issue, whether it's the sexual trafficking issue, or Russiagate, or anything else, is to say, what are the facts? What do they show? And let's just deal with them, even if they're uncomfortable. And so I feel that, in my opinion, I don't have enough facts available with the coronavirus scandal to really make an assessment. I say scandal, coronavirus issue, to make an assessment. But I would just say that all of the worst interests appear to be involved in profiting from it, regardless of, I don't have the facts.
I'm more on that.
Exactly
I'm sort of more on that. That that coronavirus was just all of us sleeping at the wheel, and these these animals in the terrible condition, and then it just avalanched into this huge cluster that we're in. But certainly it is true that the powers to be, instead of responding the way they should be to the coronavirus, instead they're doing more shock doctrines, and they're and even weaponizing it to do the whole pivot to Asia with China.
Exactly. Yeah, they're doing everything that they can to profit from it in terms of just wealth transfer, to take advantage of it, in my opinion, to create a more repressive state situation in multiple different countries. There's this discussion about the Great Reset. So, as somebody who has no medical background whatsoever, I don't feel I have the authority or position to comment on, origins of it, or the reality of it, or anything like that. But what I can say is that, in watching the response to it, it looks like just the worst interests out there are definitely looking to profit from it and looking to twist it to their own ends. And does that mean that doesn't mean I don't think people should try to be careful and, wash their hands and social distance or whatever they need to do. But we can do all of that while also remaining skeptical, and especially skeptical of these interests that are profiting from the situation. And I think too that we also we risk something when we I don't want to say hyperbolize, but when we don't also take into account the great harm that the response to the coronavirus has had for many people in different situations. Now, whether that's, people saying goodbye to their dying loved ones, unable to actually hold them, or whether it's people whose suicidality has been impacted by isolation, or whether it's people who are perpetrators of domestic violence, being stuffed into their homes on a permanent basis with their families, and then the domestic violence that has resulted from that. There are lots of different outcomes that are very negative that have happened as a result of the response to the coronavirus. And you can kind of look at that without saying that there should be no response at all. And so I think that there should be an open-minded middle ground. But unfortunately, like so many issues like Russiagate, it becomes, if you are remotely, and also with the latest US election, if you're remotely skeptical of the establishment's narrative in any way, then you're a crazy conspiracy theorist and you just should be marginalized. So I think that it's actually easy to become that way and to go, okay, well, if I'm going to be called a conspiracy theorist, I'm just going to go all out and just, like go to the nth degree of that. But I think that it's best to try to stay open-minded and skeptical and commonsensical, no matter how much you're marginalized, because it doesn't really help anybody to kind of go out on an ideological limb in either direction just because of censorship, or because you're given more of a platform for towing the correct line. So some people kind of navigate or gravitate towards towing the establishment line because they know that it gets them less censorship. They know that they get more AdSense revenue on YouTube or whatever it might be. And then you have the opposite direction, people who realize, okay, they're being censored, so they're going to go more and more extreme in the opposite direction, because that also gives people a lot of attention, sort of from the audience that really wants the anti-establishment view. And so that in itself can then become something where you're kind of creating clickbait or making things hyperbolic in order to get that larger audience. And so basically, I think that it's really a difficult thing for independent journalists to stay grounded and centered and just factual. I think but there are plenty of them doing that. There are plenty of them doing a great job, whether it's Whitney Webb, who we've talked about a lot tonight, or whether it's Kevin Gostol at Shadowproof, whether it's the wonderful people at the Grey Zone Project, all of the the outlets that you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion. The World Socialist website is an incredible resource. I love that they're reporting. So there are definitely journalists doing a good job. But I'm just saying that there's a tendency in either direction to kind of decide, okay, well, I'm going to pick a side, and whether it's pro-establishment or anti-establishment, I'm just going to go 100% in that direction. And it's like, guys, stop with the sides. Just, anyway.
But then last two issues then before we close this interview is going back to how evil the state actually is, and why, and again, with Epstein and Dutrow, for people who say, like, come on, our governments can't be that bad, and I say to them, guys, yes, the governments can be that bad. Governments are that bad, because just even putting aside Epstein or all of the massive imperial war crimes, all in the name of imperialism, that happens in Syria, in Libya, Iraq, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and so forth. I mean, America, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, these were nations founded, on the brutal, colonial theft of other people's lands, and then subjugating, the indigenous population that they practically, wiped out, so many people into these little reserves. And then if that wasn't enough, they had to do the residential schools, they had to do the stolen generations, all for crazy, eugenics reasons and so forth. And I mean, the eugenics movement, a lot of that was sanctioned by the states and by local governments. And then you think of, Ireland. I mean, you mentioned Northern Ireland. I was thinking about the Mary Magdalene Aslam scandals,
right?
And what the Catholic Church alone was just doing in covering up the systemic child abuse scandals. So yeah, governments are that bad. Governments are evil. And I mean, just in terms of like the whole police brutality. Now, I don't know if abolishing police is the answer. I mean, there's a part of me that still falls into the police are evil, but at times they're a necessary evil because we do need them to capture a rapist or a pedophile. But then when you look at the fact that the FBI was founded by, J. Edgar Hoover and all the shenanigans and human rights abuses he scandaled in Waco, yeah, I don't know what the answer to that is. I do think that we do need to abolish, the CIA, the NSA, Mossad, MI5, MI6, CSIS, and all of that. The police, I mean, that's, we probably have to do, a different episode on just that. But what are your thoughts on that, though?
Well, in terms of just the evil of the state, and I think
Yeah.
it's important and interesting that you brought up the church too, because I think that although the church, nowadays in our current era is it's not a state. It was a huge institution of power. I think the state now is the equivalent of what the church was centuries ago, obviously, and what it shows us is that, and what the various evils of whether it's these child trafficking rings and child abuse rings and the blackmail associated with them, or whether it's genocide of indigenous peoples, whether it's slavery, what have you, is that power is this massive source of evil. And so it doesn't even matter if it's a state or a church. It's when that church has the institutional authority that the state does now that it becomes this huge tool of injustice and evil. For sure. I definitely agree with that. And I think that especially though the intelligence agencies are even more so a tool of evil because they are so they operate in secret. And that's why WikiLeaks is so important, because they reveal so much of that. But and I guess that's where I differentiate them from the police a little bit, is because the police, at least nominally, are supposed to operate in the public sphere, on the ground with people, whereas these intelligence agencies do everything under this veil of darkness that we don't get to see. And so there's this real insidious quality to that I think is especially bad. And I think it results in some of these especially bizarre and awful situations. I think, though, that regardless, what the reason that it's even more insidious is really because it has almost unlimited power within that secrecy, and so it just is an amplification of the power, the evil, and the way in which power corrupts in general, whether it's in police, whether it's in a church, or whatever. So I think journalists like Caitlin Johnston have done a good job of discussing the fact that psychopaths
contributor to Consortium News as well, right?
Yeah, and she does a great job. She has a great job describing the way in which our power structures, whether they're in the church or whether they're in the state or whether it's intelligence agencies or the police, they all are structured in such a way that any psychopath who enters those professions will inevitably rise to the top of the power structure, because they're not interested in doing their job well. They're interested in power, and they're interested in ascension to the top of those structures. So then when you have those structures run by psychopaths and in upper middle management and in leadership positions, then you have the institution of these really evil policies, these evil secret operations, and on it goes. And you also have, in a profession like the police force, you also have a situation where you can legally enact violence. Same with the military. You can legally kill people. So if you're a psychopath, that's pretty appealing. And so I think that what we have to address is the way in which our power structure attracts and is infected by psychopathy. And we cannot, my only hesitation with any of the abolish stuff is not so much that it shouldn't happen. It's that I don't know, it's hard for me to fathom what structure could ever be created that wouldn't have that problem. And so then, as Caitlin Johnston points out, we would have to have no structure. And that becomes an anarchist kind of argument, which in theory I'm okay with, but I just don't know how that would work in tangible terms. So I guess I'm kind of.
And I certainly don't trust people enough that
right.
that we completely abolish the states. I certainly don't trust that people would be more civil towards one another. I mean, like, you see, like, how batshit some people are going, with the measures against the coronavirus lockdown, and people, protesting against the streets. And it's like, yes, I'm against the austerity, as a response to coronavirus, but this is a highly infectious disease, and I would rather just, stay indoors, and when I do go out, take a hospital mask. And then, so there's a part of me that just does not trust people enough to be left to their own devices if you completely abolished, the states and the police.
Yeah. So then my thought, and I've gone through this, this kind of thought experiment many times, and in conversation with people, and I guess my ultimate thought about it is that it doesn't even really matter whether one says or agrees with the premise of abolishing police or abolishing the CIA. I think abolishing the CIA would be a fantastic thing. But
yeah, definitely.
in a practical sense, though, it's 99.999% not going to happen. So what I think, rather than having arguments with people about what you think of one statement of this should happen, it's to say, what can we actually do? And then my answer to that is that we can be exceptionally skeptical of power at all times, knowing that it can be this evil. And so therefore, that's why it's so important to cover these stories, because it helps inform people about why they should be so skeptical of it. In addition to the stories of police brutality and others, and stories of absolute outright murder in the Middle East during these wars, all of those stories, the collateral murder video, all of these are so important because they give us the information that allows us to be critical. That's what I think is the most important. And I think that it's not that by being critical, we will abolish anything per se, but we will be less susceptible to the lies put out by these institutions and the lies of the media trying to protect these institutions. And we can, I hope, as a more informed public, not consent to further power being usurped by these institutions. And I'm not trying to argue here for incremental change. I'm just trying to say that if we don't have information, there can be no change at all. And so I think that people should fight for all of the change they can possibly get. And that good independent journalism is the only way to do that. And so that's where I start personally, is that's where I feel I can make a difference. And whatever other people feel they can do to make a difference, they should absolutely do. But that's just where I come from. So.
And then lastly, do you think the reason why so much left-leaning media outlets haven't been reporting the Epstein affair, inviting Whitney Webb on to talk about the Epstein affair, in which she's exposed how all of those deep states, the UK, US, Israel, colluding with organized crime and figures in the entertainment and fashion industry to do these awful, these awful human trafficking rings and the sexual blackmail. Do you think that the reason why so many left-leaning outlets haven't invited Whitney Webb on to talk about that is because, much of the pseudo-left has been cheering on the deep state for the past, 4 years, just because they all suffer from, Trump derangement syndrome? Do you think that's the reason? On top of the fact that Minpress News, Last American Vagabond, like Consortium News, has been pushing back against other propaganda, which those pseudo-left outlets have been recycling, and this goes back to, Syria, Ukraine, and the anti-Russia stuff, as well as throwing Julian Assange under the bus.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's correct. I think that those are huge reasons that Whitney Webb has not been kind of interviewed by the people she should have been. I also think that it's because, in addition to the fact that these outlets are kind of indebted to or in bed with these intelligence agencies, they also are very well aware that Democratic figures like Bill Clinton, that politicians on quote unquote their side of the fence would be implicated. And while some of the coverage of the Epstein scandal does recognize the fact that Clinton was, traveling with Epstein on the Lolita Express and that type of thing, they generally kind of give him a pass in the really critical coverage. But I noticed, because I was watching these documentaries to cover them, and I was watching how many times they showed Clinton and talked about Clinton versus how many times they repeated the same clip of Trump with Epstein. I'm like, they're both with Epstein. Are you really going to try to tilt it at one way or the other? Arguably, Clinton was closer to Epstein than Trump was, but who cares? They both were partying with the guy. Is that not the perfect example of them all being the same breed of monster? I don't know, but anyway, so yeah, I think they understand that Whitney and her research it's not bipartisan, it's nonpartisan, and they have a partisan horse in the race to protect, just in terms of the establishment Democrats. And also, in addition to that, there is the issue that you brought up of the fact that she's exposing these intelligence agencies, and the news outlets are absolutely wedded to the intelligence agencies, so they're not going to cover that. But then thirdly, I agree with you. I think that Whitney and then these other independent news outlets and these journalists have done a great job covering these various issues, not just Epstein and not just human trafficking, which in some ways embarrasses establishment-friendly media. It doesn't just go against them. It doesn't just disagree with their narrative. It embarrasses them because it's doing the real journalism they should be doing. And I think that's another reason that they hate WikiLeaks so much and they hate Assange so much. It's not simply that that they think that he helped Clinton lose or that he was somehow working with the Russians. It's the fact that he's shown them up on so many levels. So I think that they don't want people to realize that independent journalists are doing a better job than they are. So they don't want a Whitney Webb coming on and showing what great work she's done, because that's kind of cutting into their market share. And they don't want to give people like that a platform and a voice. And that's another reason, though, that I think the independent media should therefore do the exact opposite and try to help each other as much as possible in terms of, amplifying each other's work where they can, trying to just give each other a hand up rather than competing with each other as if it's like this, zero-sum game. Because the audience of independent media is usually shared amongst multiple different outlets. Like people who read the Gray Zone Project are also reading World Socialist website, are very concerned about WikiLeaks. It's a shared audience. And so I think that us trying to work together and help each other, especially in terms of fighting censorship, is really important. And I think that is the antidote to the kind of shutting out process that happened to Whitney.
Yeah, it's crazy, but certainly are going to have our work cut out for us now that we have, sleepy, creepy, sleazy Joe Biden.
Yeah. You have to laugh.
And Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton having their political comeback, and it's we're going to be in for a bumpy ride. But again, that's why we need. But again, that's why I started 1+1 at once and invite voices who aren't invited on much of the left-leaning outlets, and having people like yourself on, Miss Adley, Miss Webb, and so forth. But and because we really need to do that, because we really have our work cut out for us, and it's not and a lot of those rival oligarchs, like George Soros, Patrick Lannan, and Pierre Omidyar have basically co-opted so much of the left. And so we have our work, cut out in terms of fighting back, because I'm pretty sure when the late Robert Parry was alive, he probably never would have dreamt in his wildest years that he would have had people come to Consortium News to be pushing back against what Democracy Now! Or The Intercept have been doing on something like Syria.
Exactly. And I think that The Intercept is such a great example of that issue and that problem. It's really a sad thing, but yeah, when you're funded by a billionaire, I don't think it's going to end well.
Exactly. All right. Well, on that note, Ms. Vos, because I think it's getting late over in Arkansas, and 5:46 a.m.
Very late where you are too. Yeah.
But all right. Well, all right. I think that's a pretty good place to end. So. We were joined on 1+1 with Elizabeth Vos, who's a contributor to Consortium News, co-host of Consortium News Live. I'm going to link to all of your articles that we mentioned, as well as the fact that it's Consortium News' 25th birthday. So I'm also going to link into the article that Joe Loria wrote about the election and celebrating Consortium News, and also Consortium News' YouTube page and the website, so that people can get into Consortium News. And I highly recommend that people subscribe and donate generously. So until then, Ms. Vos, thank you so much for joining me on 1+1, and I look forward to many more conversations in the future.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate it.
An honor to have you, so thank you.